You're right now. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on what part of the world that you're in, and welcome to Queen's University in Belfast for the Google Hangout for our course Conflict, Identity and Public Space. Please, I hope you don't expect a hugely professional media display from us, because this is the first time that we've ever done anything like this before ourselves. But we're very much looking forward to responding to some of the masses of stuff we've had on the discussion groups in the first week of the course. Firstly, I'd like to say how gratifying it is to see the sort of debates that have been taking place. Secondly, we've had an amazing amount of material on the Padlet board. Now, I know some of you will find it difficult to upload stuff and to use some of that. I'm in exactly the same space. In the last few weeks, I've been learning how to use it again. And as I hope you can see, even if you just want to load up some text onto that wall at the end of this week, please do so. Just because some people are getting very good, and we'll show you some of the stuff that people are doing. It doesn't mean that some good old-fashioned text in the right place doesn't work as well. And there's been some amazing material up there. I've seen stuff on the Boys Brigade, on rugby, the critical mass cycling. Somebody's managed to put up some Stiff Little Fingers, one of my favourite bands, is actually my favourite piece of music ever live. There's been some great pictures, and the international nature of it all is also fantastic. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to Sam Pearson, who you've already seen in some of the discussions. Sam's at the Centre for Identity and Intergroup Relations up at the School of Psychology, and also one of the PhD students and one of your mentors on this course, Megan Miller, who's also at the School of Psychology. And between us, we're going to pick up on some of the questions that you put on the Future Learn website, and we're going to have a discussion about some of those issues, which in turn I hope will promote more from yourselves, because as I hope you understand, none of us ever think that we've got the final word on these issues, and the debates on the Future Learn website I hope are an example of that. So with that, we're going to think about some of the questions and go through some of the courses. And Megan has been watching quite a few of the discussions going on. So Megan, are there any particular things that you'd like to start by picking out on that people have been talking about?
Yes, on the 20 statement test, a lot of people were saying that they were having difficulty deciding if an identity was a social or like an individual one.
The identities. Sam, that's your neck of the woods. 20 questions test.
Yeah.
I was also confused by it, everybody. So, Sam.
Yeah. So I saw that as well, actually. So quite a few of the comments, people would maybe give a particular example of an identity that they have, like somebody who wears glasses, for example, and they'd say, this could be a group identity. It's something I share with other people, but it's also something a part of my personal uniqueness as well. And how do you categorize those things? And it seems like that was quite a difficult thing to do. So this, in fact, that question, it actually taps into something that has been raised as a criticism of the social identity tradition in research, where people say, actually, this distinction, this sort of fundamental distinction between personal identity and social identity, maybe it doesn't hold together very well, because most of the actual elements of our identity we look at, they could be both at the same time. They could be one and become the other, or the other way around. So this has come up, as a matter of debate in the literature as to whether this distinction is actually sustainable. The way that I think about this is that, indeed, from the point of view of the actual element of identity, from an objective point of view, there's no difference. There's no difference between a group thing and a personal characteristic of some sort. It's just that some of those will sometimes contribute to a feeling of we, and some of them won't. But that's a matter of how they function in my life. It's not a matter of the element itself. So, for example, my date of birth, I share with many other people. I don't know who they are, but I share it with them. So very rarely would I feel a sense of us or we with them. But it is, from an objective point of view, it's a shared characteristic. So then, what's a social psychologist, Bernd Simon in Germany, has said about this is that a useful way of looking at it is that your personal identity is all of these attributes, or many attributes in combination, define you as unique. So if I list things off, I say, I'm 33 years old, I wear glasses, I've got this color hair, I'm English, and so on, as a list as you do in the TST, this builds up a sense of uniqueness about me. But where one of those things is foregrounded and the other things recede into the background, then that's where you have a sense of us, because that's one quality that comes
which of course is exactly what happens at group events.
Exactly.
If you're out at a ritual or a parade or a demonstration, precisely what you're doing at that moment is foregrounding that one particular identity, which is what makes then those group moments so important and interesting to study.
That's right. So it's a relative foregrounding of one or maybe two, but a smaller number that turns it into a group thing versus having many, which is more individualizing. So I think, those are very useful comments, and it's quite, from a conceptual point of view, quite good to understand that. There's a thought experiment that Bernd Simon offers to talk about how one can become the other, and he uses that same example that one of our commenters mentioned, which is wearing glasses. And he says that usually wearing glasses is not something that forms the basis of the social identity. Okay, all three of us are wearing glasses here, but we haven't, I don't think so far, felt as an us on that basis. But he says that, hypothetically, if we think in terms of the thought experiment, imagine a dictatorial, kind of oppressive government that decides that wearing glasses is an indication of being an intellectual and therefore being dangerous, and therefore people who wear glasses should be persecuted. Or perhaps some kind of eugenic program where they say, short-sightedness needs to be eradicated from the gene pool, and therefore people who wear glasses should be sterilized. Okay, these are slightly ridiculous, absurd, but as a thought example, we can imagine that that is something that would then give us something in common that is very important. We would have to group together, act together in order to protect ourselves or something like this. And that's an example of how a single characteristic could function as individualizing or as a social identity, as kind of events like that.
I sometimes use, when I'm doing lectures, some of the sort of early sociology or anthropology lectures, one of the examples I do to try and make people think about how that identity can matter is I stand in front of my class and I say, well, I hope you're all going to do very well in the essays. I really hope you're all going to do. Now, I would like the women in the class to try harder because generally you don't do very well at this. Now, the minute I say that, all right, I've in a sense turned on their identity, the identity of being a woman or a man in that room, even though they obviously came in as women and as men and sat there as women and men, the identity wasn't, it was an individual identity. But the minute I act as a sexist lecturer, and I obviously don't mean that, I don't mean that, but the minute I do that, I've turned on that identity, and in a sense, all you then need is a number of women in the class to say, we're going to complain to him about the university. And not only have you turned on their identity, they're now politically organised. So they're examples of sort of how that relationship. And actually, I think we've got a good example from the Padlet screen. One of the students has did this, I think it's a cloud of their identity, a beautiful coloured cube of how their identity works, which is extraordinary, but cleverer than I can do on any of these sort of things. A relationship between the social and the cultural and the individual and various parts, and you can see how they've given colour to each of those aspects of their identity. Now, if we were to imagine that cube or that person, I would suspect what we would say is in their daily routine, the brightness and the darkness of those different identities could change. It's all there, all right, but the different aspects of it are going to be important depending on what part of the day that they're in. You know, and that shift from personal identity to group identity is sort of what human beings do in their everyday lives.
It's interesting. I mean, that 20 statements test. We've used it here as an educational tool and to get people to think about the multifaceted nature of their identities. As a research tool, I'm actually rather skeptical of the 20 statements test, precisely because when you are asking for a whole configuration of many at the same time, that is almost automatically a personal identity. You know, because as we've said, social identity is when one becomes more important and the others are relatively less important at the point in time. So if you ask the question, who am I? And it's who am I, not who are we? And then you ask for many things, then that, you know, maybe it is a good way of studying personal identity. But even if the things that are listed there are groups, the fact that they're all there in a configuration makes it an individualist kind of thing that you get from it. So social identity is not just that you have elements of group memberships as part of your identity. It's a sense of us that comes from the usness being more important than the me-ness at a point in time.
It's also important to remind ourselves that when you use these sort of tests, they are models. I mean, they are structured in a particular way to try and get at something. They're not an exact reflection of reality. They can't be. And in psychology and sociology and those sort of things, we're constantly trying to find better ways of understanding those relationships. But the minute you put them into a test, you know that you're somehow doing damage to that complexity. So you should never see something like that as providing an absolute answer, just giving us some sort of a picture. One of the other questions that came up as I was reading through, which was quite interesting, was a general sense that some people have that identity is a dangerous thing, a fear of identity. And I think that came out of a sense that when somebody's in an in-group, they're effectively always making other people an out-group, so that our social world is full of that sort of thing, and it's full of people being discriminated against. And I in many ways, I appreciate the fears that people have of that. So there's a sense some people have put in comments about why do we need to have that sort of thing, and that struck a few ideas with me, because a very long-standing sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, has this. I hope I'm not doing his theory justice. He's a great thinker, but one of the things he's talked about is how our society is caught between the notion that we all want to be individuals, that we have our own individual identity, but also the general necessity that we want to be part of a group. The word, and we'll talk about this later in the course, the word community comes up a lot, which is a nice safe place that we can all be. Now, we will talk later in the course about why communities are not always safe places. But for now, that idea that we're caught between the group identity that we need to feel safe, but the fact that individualism, we want to be a self. Sam, is there anything you can say about people who are talking around the fear that they have around that social identity? Can we escape that in any way?
Yeah, well, of course, it's an interesting, very interesting question indeed. I guess one thing that I would say, first of all, I suppose as a kind of conceptual clarification, if you like, is that when we say that we say something like, in order to have an in-group, you have to have an out-group. It's relational. As soon as you have a sense of us, there is automatically, logically, there must be a sense of them, those people who are not us. And of course, on a straightforward, logical level, that's true indeed. You can't have us without them. You can't have in without out. It doesn't make sense. But that's true in exactly the same sense that I can't have I without you, and I can't have me without you. It's relational in the same sense. So just as social identities logically exclude in that categorization sense, so do personal identities, because I excludes everybody who's not me. So on that level, when we say that there's an inevitable exclusion that goes with the inclusion, that's true, but we have to understand it on that level. It's a question of conceptually, if you have one side of the polarity, you have to have the other side. We shouldn't then conclude from that we have exclusion in an oppressive sense. We have exclusion in a categorization sense, but not necessarily in the sense of excluding or oppressing or doing harm to people. Now, of course, that happens. That's why people have this concern. We see all around us in the world that this is happening. But to see that as an inevitable outcome of in-group formation, I think is problematic. One example that I quite like to use to illustrate this is, I remember very clearly around the time of the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, the huge demonstrations that took place in the UK against that war. And the main slogan that people were marching under, I don't know if anybody else remembers it, but it was "Not in our name." Okay, not in our name. So the word "our" is there. So there's very clearly a strong sense of us, of collective identity behind that. Yeah, the sense of not just people were opposing the war as concerned individuals, but they were opposing it collectively and on the basis of a shared identity. So the reason I use that example is that it's clear that people can mobilize around an us without the agenda of that us being to harm others. On the contrary, in this case, it was an anti-militaristic cause that people were united around. So that's as an example. And then, so another thing I'd say about this is, in terms of the history of how these ideas were developed. So we've mentioned Tajfel, and there's some reading about Tajfel on the website. So why did Tajfel develop the notion of social identity? What was he interested in? Well, the answer is that he was interested, among other things, in social change. He was interested in how societies change, how inequality is challenged, how people are able to act together powerfully to challenge their oppression, their exclusion. And in order to do that, he had to understand how people were able to act in a unified way, where their shared experience of being disadvantaged or oppressed became more important than the differences that divided them, to bring them together to act. So this is the starting point for him to understand how those sorts of things happen. And I think there we can see why it is that, for sure, we have to understand what leads us from in-group formation and social identity towards, collective violence, oppression, exclusion, and all of those things. And, really, really crucial things for social scientists to grapple with. At the same time, you can see the danger if you take away a notion of social identity and you insist really morally we must only think about our individuality, then you're removing that potential for collective solidarity and so forth. And in fact, in some ways, although of course certainly I would say I would like people to have the freedom to have their individuality, to express it, and individuality is important. I wouldn't want to live in a world where we are entirely focused on being our own unique little snowflake, to the point that we weren't able to see that, in fact, we do have shared concerns with other people, that certainly at certain points, that sharedness is more important than our uniqueness, certainly at a certain point in time to achieve certain aims. So I wouldn't want to remove social identities from the world from that point of view.
That Tajfel idea of wanting to understand social change is, I think, a vital part of the groundwork that we wanted to lay down in the first week of this course, because it's very easy in the stories that places and people tell about themselves to make identities feel static. You know, whether it's our national identities or even our gendered identities, that they've always stayed the same. Whereas so much of the evidence shows, and this is what Tajfel's fascinated in, the fact that things change, that social movements come together, that people change. I've just run from a really interesting seminar at Queen's on Scottishness and Scottish identity. People know there's a Scottish referendum. And the researcher was looking at the changes of people's notions of Scottishness over a 30-year period. It's quite distinctive. You know, it hasn't stayed the same over 500 years. It hasn't even stayed the same over 20 years. You know, so that the getting to the core of this is important, because when we go on and look at how social movements work and social change in the public space, we've got that basis to start looking at.
Yeah.
Megan, do you want to pick up on what's the next one you were?
We have a question, and I apologize, and I'm probably going to mispronounce your name, but Santandra and Danmore asked if it's possible to lose an identity.
Right. Well, there was a lot of people also talking about ascribed and achieved identities. I mean, some of the ways we tend to talk about identity tend to sometimes give us the sense that we have the choice of gaining or losing it, that it's this great world where I can be what I want to be, and there's a level of truth in that. On the other hand, though, identities are also ascribed, we don't have choice over how we do that. How would you model that question, Sam, of what, you know, when we can lose an identity or gain one, and what power we have around that?
Well, that's an interesting one. So I suppose we've been, in this first week, we've really sort of emphasized the changeability, the flux, you know, and we've been trying to highlight that. Of course, the reality very often is that, you know, our identities are not totally chaotic, changing every day and choosing this thing or that thing in a completely, you know, random way that there's no continuity whatsoever. So clearly, you know, we've wanted to highlight the level of flux and changeability. Now we have to come back and deal with the matter of how within that do you have a sense of continuity. Now, I would look at this from two angles. One reason that we may have a sense of continuity in our identities, and we don't just give them up, or we can't just give them up at the drop of a hat, is internal. It's from our side, and I suppose it's the sort of thing that psychologists are usually more interested in. For example, it's often argued that there's a human motive for a sense of continuity, a continuity of self. So we seek continuity, and we need that. And actually, if we didn't have any sense of personal continuity from one day to the next, 1 year to the next, that would be very distressing for us. So from that sort of personal, internal point of view, there is a motivation to craft some sense of continuity in our lives. And that may mean that we don't give up identities very easily, because it's something that can give us a sense of continuity. So that's one reason why some identities may be quite persistent. The other reason, the other set of reasons, I guess, would be external reasons. It's not to do with our motive. It's to do with the way the world is structured, and because of that, the way we're treated. So we take something like a stigmatized identity, perhaps your ethnic identity in a context in which there is racism that oppresses you on the basis of that. Is, even if you wanted to, wouldn't be straightforward to say, okay, I'm not going to belong to this ethnicity anymore. I'm going to belong to an ethnicity that's treated properly. Well, we can't do that. Why can't we do that? Because the world doesn't let us do that. You know, this is about, it partly relates to the point about identity is not just in my head, it's in our relationships, they're performed, they're in our interactions. And for example, in apartheid, if you think about apartheid South Africa during that time, if somebody said, well, I'm not going to be black anymore, I'm going to be white, that would have been extremely difficult to achieve because people would have continued to treat them as a black person, whether they wanted to be treated as a black person or not. So, so part of the stability comes from stability that's out there in the world and out there in the way that, culture lends a stability to, certain categories, but there are also, legal, things, institutional things, practices that embed these categories into our lives. And it's not within the power of one person to change that just because they want to. Having said that, that doesn't mean they're completely unchangeable. And this brings us back to the answer to the previous question. Those things can be changed, but they can't be changed by individuals wanting them to change. They're changed by people coming together and challenging them collectively.
Mm. And your relationship, I mean, Megan, I'm thinking we're sitting here, all of us with our particular accents, and for those of you out there, you would probably have noticed none of us are from Belfast. Megan, where do you hail from?
Washington State.
From Washington State. So do you feel, since you've lived here, do you feel any necessity to feel like you need to fit in, or do you feel that every time you open your mouth, and I'm an English person who's lived in Ireland for 30 years, every time you open your mouth, you're sort of giving away a certain part of you, which means it says, I'm an outsider.
Not so much in Belfast, surprisingly. A lot of people can't identify me as American right away.
Right.
But when I lived in England, yeah, definitely right away they're like, oh, American.
And then there's a series of questions about yourself that you inevitably...
Yeah, and even no matter how many times I say I'm from Washington State, they'll go, oh, D.C.? No, other side of the country.
Yeah, and that you cannot, I mean, that's a part of it. Even if you suddenly wanted to not be from there, and we've probably all had moments with our background when you said, you know what, I'd rather not sound that English. You can't get away from it. Yeah. Sam, did you want to pick up on any particular one? With one of the questions you were mentioning to me about structuring of groups.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, so there was a very interesting question from, I think it was Lynn, who asked this question about organized, structured groups that maybe were particularly important through the 20th century. So she's talking about things like organized trade unions, political parties, and I think churches were mentioned. Okay, very, very, very organized, very stable, large-scale groups that are progressively becoming less important, less significant in our social life, and perhaps are being replaced by much more spontaneous, complex, and also I think digitally mediated identities that have less of a formal structure, less obvious leadership, and are more changeable.
Yeah.
And so the question is this basically, a good thing or a bad thing?
It seems to me, I mean, this is something that in a way has fascinated sociologists and anthropologists. I mean, that's the sort of core of the discipline, is how do we organize social groups? Once they're organized, when do they become institutionalized? And many sociologists were interested in, sociology in the 19th century grew out of this fascination that the sociologists would have had, having looked at the Industrial Revolution come along, and you went from apparently this, and this was how it was sometimes imagined, a ruralism that the countries had, when everybody knew their place, and then all of a sudden the Industrial Revolution crashes in, and you've got these huge cities with these massive dislocated people, and you know, much of the sort of social theory that came out of 19th century theorists, Durkheim and Marx and Simmel, and then on to people like Weber, was all around that change taking place, and that we live in a more complex society. Now, as you point out, Sam, as you know, we don't live in societies which stay the same, and as ways of social networking and forming groups change, potential changes, and sometimes those changes create moments of power and bringing groups together, which can be really quite extraordinary, how it can shift things. But what I would say that might in some way answer what Lynn is suggesting is that yes, we can see that. We can see that the internet and some things seem to, and some of the old churches and some of the old structures have collapsed. However, don't underestimate how the new ones will become institutional. But you don't underestimate how they will institutionalize. They'll become organized, or as Weber would, they've become bureaucratic. You know, there have been many charismatic movements over the years. Many of the churches, particularly after the Reformations themselves, and the great historian E.P. Thompson has lots in his Making of the English Working Classes about these groups, sort of, they're coming up, religious movements, but the ones that survive become institutionalized. So that I think one of the answers that I would make to Lynn is that I wouldn't underestimate how those groups become structured after a period of time, and that it probably, to last a period of time, they have to become institutionalized, and in their time will look as sturdy as, I don't know, the Church of England or one of the great institutions. So there's always that going on in social groups, and it's a whole area to look at why social groups institutionalize, and often how charismatic groups evolve. And frankly, I suspect the internet does that in a way that we're still getting a handle on. It's still difficult to know how that is happening. So that seems to me to be one of the interesting things. And the things that we'll be looking at, like demonstrations, parades and rituals, that you can see that in those rituals, because you can see some rituals that come together, which are just groups of people. I was going to put some up in a moment. We'll talk about it. And you can see some that just come together. On the others, you see some that are highly institutionalized. You know, marches and parades which are highly controlled. And so that what Lynn points out there in the relationship between disorganization and structure, you see in the very things we're going to be talking about in the week become, you know, you see that in how those rituals. So when we start the next couple of weeks, think about that, how much structure exists in those sorts of events. There was another question on the role of language as a identity marker from Raymond Crozier, I think it was. I wonder, and Raymond was asking about how people use language as an identity marker. I think his particular circumstances, looking at the rise of the Welsh language. Is there any research, Sam, that we can pick on to look at how we can learn about how language is used?
Yeah, well, so the ways of looking at I don't know very much. I have to say I don't know very much about Wales and Welsh politics. So I'm trying to answer this question in a way that doesn't reveal my ignorance too much, and also, you know, without taking a position on you know, whether the revival of Welsh language is good or bad or whatever. But I'd say a couple of things about, you know, where that would be coming from. So we think about nationalism as being, you know, the ideology or the meanings associated with what it means to be a nation, and what are the claims that go along with, you know, what goes along with claiming to be a nation. Then it's quite clear that conventionally, if you want to claim nationhood for a certain group, you want to claim that a certain group is a nation and should have the, rights and entitlements that we accept nations have, like autonomy, then language is real help in terms of the credibility of those claims. If a group can say we have our own language, then that will certainly lend a lot of weight to the claim that they are a nation. I'm not saying objectively the language is the criteria for a nation or not. All of these things are, contested and ideological and so on. But conventionally, language, if you've got one, that's going to help your claim to nationhood. Okay, that's how things work. So certainly that's part of what this is about. The sense of, in order to have a sense of nationhood, it's good to have a language. I suppose another thing, which is maybe to do with perhaps the way that Welsh nationalists might see this, is that the reason, and again, I'm not taking a position, but I would imagine that what they would say is that the reason that Welsh language is not more widely spoken is because it was systematically suppressed in favour of the English language. So there's a sense of Welsh language has been lost as a result of some illegitimate oppression by the English, and with that there's a kind of sense of, in order to be empowered, to have a sense of self-esteem and confidence, pride, there needs to be restoring something that was taken away by the oppressor. So that's I think a way of seeing that, the way that language often functions, and a revival of the language, and I would imagine it's very similar with Irish language as well.
Mm-hmm.
You've got those same kinds of things at play.
Although I think I'm right in saying this, one of the ironies is that the use of language, although Welsh nationalism is probably weaker historically than Scottish and Irish nationalism, the Welsh language is probably stronger in Wales than Irish is in Ireland, or Scottish or Scottish Gaelic is in Scotland, where perhaps we see the most strong sense of identity.
There is another thing, sorry, Dom, just that occurred to me. So with that, so we can say it's probably related to the project of Welsh autonomy, seeking Welsh autonomy on a political level. It's a double-edged sword, because of course what that means is that if you base Welsh nationhood and Welsh identity on Welsh language, that means that anybody who doesn't speak Welsh is not going to feel part of that. So if you want to mobilise people to support a certain project like Welsh autonomy, you need to mobilise people quite widely. You need many people to. So this is the thing, to make Welsh language central means excluding potential supporters or people who live in Wales who might see themselves as Welsh and might therefore buy into a sense of Welsh autonomy. They won't do that if Welsh is made an essential criteria for being an authentic Welsh person. So the politics around this are quite subtle, actually, and there is an interesting paper by colleagues at Cardiff University, by social psychologists, where they show this, that in different parts of Wales, so for example in parts of Wales where Welsh language is very widely spoken and therefore is considered essential to call yourself, to have a claim on being Welsh, that people who don't feel Welsh, if they live in those places, they won't identify as Welsh and they won't support Welsh autonomy. Whereas in parts of Wales where not many people speak Welsh, even those who don't speak Welsh identify with Wales and support Welsh autonomy. So you have this very, very interesting dual effect of Welsh language being brought into the politics there, that it can marginalise potential supporters at the same time as be a base for mobilisation.
It's a very common problem for nationalist movements around the world, that on the one hand, language is symbolically important for many of them. On the other hand, they are living in places where there is such diversity of language, and they might not be a minority. For their campaign to win, if they stress that language too much, they're excluding too many people. And it is language is such a fascinating marker, both in interpersonal terms, but in political terms as well. There was another thing that I wanted to look at. On the Padlet wall, there have been a number of great text things put up, but one of the things that struck me was one here called a Ugandan adventure by someone talking about putting up their experience of going to Uganda. And one of the things that struck me about it was the description of feeling a sense of groupness with people from diverse cultures. I was struck how much we have in common with people from other cultures, rather than the interesting differences between cultures. And I think it's quite interesting to make that point, that there are different ways of people feeling a sense of belonging, and if we fall into the trap of feeling just because there's diversity you can't feel a sense of bonding, a sense of belonging, we'll be coming to this later as well in the course, then you're sort of making a mistake, because most of us live in places where we've come from diverse backgrounds but have, friends from all sorts of different places and feel bonded in those sort of places. And the other thing that struck me about that, and this has been a sort of theme that we've tried to follow on this week, is the role of emotion. Now, as social scientists can find it very difficult to pin down what emotion is, and I know psychologists spend a lot of time trying to work out what the heck emotion is, and if you have difficulties trying to, us in the social sciences find it even harder, and some great anthropology. A number of my colleagues here look at the notion of how emotion works. However, we sort of know that it's the glue that brings those bonding moments together, so that even when you're looking at what appears to be cultural diversity, you can be in places and moments where you're in a position where the emotion of being in that position is going to bring you together. I mean, I don't know if you've got anything to add about how emotion works, but it seems, whilst difficult to get hold of, it also seems to be a bit of the glue that we're talking about here.
Yeah, well, it does seem to be, you can't argue that whatever emotion is quite core to our experience as human beings. The way that we experience the world and make sense of it, and also how we understand other people's ways of experiencing and making sense of it is through emotions and understanding other people's emotions. So from that point of view, it goes without saying that if we're trying to understand who is like us and who is fundamentally similar to us in order to have a sense of us, then we're going to be looking at shared experiences, shared emotions. So sure, that's a very powerful example that part of the don't want to get into an argument with anthropologists and psychology about universality of emotion. Okay, this is a big thing. How much emotion is a universal human thing, how much culturally specific and so on. But let's say that there are emotional experiences that are more or less human universals that run deeper than many of the obvious differences that we can see. Then sure, sharing those emotional experiences with people from a different culture is something that's going to really cement that sense of commonality with them.
Now I think about it, I don't know if you felt this, Meg. When I've travelled in the past, it's amazing how quickly you can emotionally bond to other people you've never met, who you haven't. I don't know if you found that.
Oh, absolutely. I did a semester abroad in Leeds, and within a month, the people I lived with were a little family, and it was an intense little emotional family.
Yeah, the common experience of being a traveller together in a strange place. So you could be from really diverse backgrounds. That common experience can emotionally, and I'm thinking of the years I backpacked and travelled. I think there were people I knew for one day. We were stuck, we were backpacking in the middle of the Thai jungle, and I'd ended up telling them my deepest secrets, because somehow that experience of togetherness had given an emotion. Some of them I kept in touch with more than I might have done, people I knew for years and years and years.
Yeah. I mean, another illustration here of that importance of emotion. There's a really interesting area of social psychology that deals with what's called infrahumanization, which is basically infrahumanization is a kind of dehumanization, relatively subtle kind. It's seeing people as less than human, or less human than us, let's say, seeing an outgroup as less human than us. So the question is, how are outgroups dehumanized in a relatively subtle way, without calling them animals, without depicting them as vermin and rats and all those, pretty obvious, blatant kind of dehumanization, which also happen. What are the subtle ways? And what's emerged here is that the way in which others' emotions are described, and the way outgroups' emotions are described, achieves a kind of dehumanization. So what actually happens is that often a disliked outgroup, when people are describing their experiences, will use different words to describe their emotions than compared to if they're talking about in-group. When you're talking about in-group or a liked outgroup, you'll use more sophisticated, nuanced, complex emotion terms to imply that the person that you're talking about has quite a rich emotional experience. But when you're talking about outgroups, particularly ones that are threatening or that you don't like, you don't say that they feel nostalgic or sentimental or melancholic, these uniquely human, nuanced emotions. You'll say they're angry, or they're elated, or they're agitated. It's these things which are more basic kinds of emotions, and perhaps emotions that may be even shared with animals. So the point I'm making here is that understanding the complexity of someone else's emotions and seeing that it's complex and full of meaning just like yours is part of the way that we humanize other people, that we see them as human just like us. And simplifying or talking about people's emotions in a way that makes them seem more simple, perhaps more, less cultivated, perhaps, is a subtle way of dehumanizing them.
Yeah. The reason for going through all of this stuff in this first week, by looking at what identity is, by looking at the relationship between the individual and the group, by looking at emotion, is because what we want to go on and look at, and I'm going to look at a couple of things on the Padlet board now, is why expressing these things in public spaces becomes important, and what the role of rituals and crowd events is. Because what you'll have gathered is that the building blocks for understanding why those things are important, and we will look at the political outworkings of that. The building blocks for that is the stuff that we discussed, which is why we wanted to go through some of this. And I picked up, the Padlet wall has got so many great examples of things, but I picked up two of what appear to be fairly random demonstrations or groups of people together. One, I think, was the Occupy movement in Quebec. All right, this is a video I take it has been put up of some protesters. Clearly, I'm guessing this, by the way, but clearly this is not an particularly well-organized group. But when you watch it, you can get the sense of people coming together and the power they have of emotionally feeling that they're part of a group and sort of beginning to take over the streets. And there's lots of protests over the years, including lots of carnivals that have always been about taking over the streets. So that was one sort of random example that I quite liked. There was another example where you could see this very clearly, if we run this for a few moments. This is a critical mass bike protest in central London. Now, I had a quick look through. We won't go through all of the 4 or 5 minutes, but you can see the people gathering, and there's obviously an element of planning to this, and we've had critical mass protests in Belfast as well. But you can see how the cars at one moment are sort of running along the street, but very quickly how a group of people change the power relationships in that space, and all of a sudden a hectically busy London space becomes full of people who, when managing their space in a particular way, and in an emotional way, because as we play the video on, they start singing together, they start doing lots of togethery sort of things and creating a sense of what one sociologist called groupiness and a sense of belonging. And you can see the sense of empowerment that comes in it. You can now see that they've stopped the cars. Now, I also suspect that those people now sitting in the traffic jam behind these people are getting pretty pissed off. So I suspect there's also an identity slowly evolving in those car drivers. And that, of course, is the difficulty with the in-grouping, out-grouping. Whilst that popularity amongst that group is growing, there's a sense of resentment that will be growing in the commuters of London. Although as a cyclist myself, I often feel part of an out-group and rather powerless on the road. So that's an example of some of these things coming together, of a sense of group. Now, does that group identity sustain itself over a long period of time? The emotions of doing it, I suspect, are quite powerful. I suspect the people in it, if you can stop a whole London street, if you can bring London to a halt, or any of the cities, as we see in demonstrations about the place, there can be enormous power. How is that sustained over time? All right, what change is taking place out of that? And lots of studies and social movements are interested in how this sort of thing works. So I thought these were quite unique. You seem to now have discussions going on between people. I thought that was quite an interesting one to look at, and the sort of thing that we're going to be looking through over the next few weeks. Particularly next week, when we're going to start to look at those public spaces in more detail and how social groups work in public spaces through rituals, through parades and carnivals, and the symbolic importance. They chose a very symbolically important space where they knew they'd have effect. It wasn't a back street of London, it was in a particular space. And that's what we'll be moving on to next week. So with that, I'd like to thank Megan and Sam for their time on what is a Friday afternoon here in Belfast. I hope the discussion has been useful to you. We've tried to pick up on some of the key questions that come along. We look forward to more stuff next week. Keep putting the stuff up on the Padlet website that we can look at. Don't be afraid of putting text up. If you just want to write a bit, do that as well, because we will try and get round and read and look at them. And so with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again at the same time next week from Queen's University in Belfast.